Right now, somewhere off the coast of Sri Lanka, 14 empty oil tankers are sitting at anchor, going nowhere. They flew out of Iranian waters weeks ago, loaded with crude, and they are never going back the way they came. Further north, in the waters off Bandar Abbas, satellites have caught almost nothing moving. No supertankers, no loading, just stillness at a port that used to be one of the busiest chokepoints on Earth. And today, the man in charge of the operation that caused all of this stood in front of reporters and said something that should stop you in your tracks. Asked how long the United States military intends to keep this up, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did not hedge. He said the Navy can maintain a blockade like this indefinitely, rotating ships in and out for as long as it takes. Not weeks, not months, indefinitely. That is the word he used, and it is worth sitting with, because an American administration rarely commits to open-ended military terminology like that in public. This is the story of how Iran's ports ended up in that position, what it has cost the wider region, who is disputing whose version of events, and why the word indefinite is now sitting at the center of one of the most consequential standoffs in the Middle East. To understand why the United States Navy is parked outside Iranian waters today, you have to go back to February 28th of this year. On that day, Israel and the United States launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury by American planners. The opening strikes were aimed squarely at the top of the Iranian regime. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in Tehran, along with dozens of senior officials, in what analysts have described as a decapitation strike built on intelligence work by the CIA and Mossad. Iranian state media confirmed his death on March 1st. Within days, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed as his successor, and Iran entered what researchers have called an unprecedented leadership crisis, with more than 40 officials killed in the opening days alone. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, President Trump framed the campaign's goals bluntly: destroy Iran's ballistic missile capability, eliminate its navy, prevent any path to a nuclear weapon, and cut off its support for regional proxy forces. He also called publicly for regime change. Iran did not stay quiet. Missiles and drones were launched at Israel, at American bases across the region, and at oil infrastructure, including shipping inside the Strait of Hormuz itself. According to Britannica's ongoing conflict summary, the fighting killed thousands of people across Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf states, and displaced millions more before a ceasefire, brokered with Pakistani mediation, finally took hold on April 8th. That ceasefire did not settle anything. It only paused the shooting long enough for diplomats to try and fail to close the gap. Delegations from Iran and the United States met in Islamabad in early April, and by April 13th, those talks had collapsed without a breakthrough. That same day, President Trump announced that the US military would begin blockading Iran's ports in the Strait of Hormuz and along the Gulf Coast. Central Command confirmed the blockade went into effect at 10 in the morning Eastern Time, targeting vessels moving to and from Iranian ports specifically. Iran's response was immediate and defiant. Tehran called the presence of American warships near the strait a direct violation of the ceasefire agreement signed only days earlier, and vowed to respond. On April 18th, according to reporting picked up across multiple outlets, Iran announced it had closed the Strait of Hormuz again, this time explicitly citing Washington's refusal to lift the new blockade. Around that same period, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps went further rhetorically, warning publicly that Iranian forces would not allow, in their words, a single liter of oil to leave the region for what they called the hostile side and its partners, until further notice. The February strikes did not go unanswered inside Iran or beyond it, either. Researchers tracking the fallout have documented that the initial wave of strikes killed roughly 170 people when a missile hit a girls' school located next to a naval base in Minab, close to Bandar Abbas, one of the single deadliest individual incidents of the opening days of the war. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, speaking on state media at the time, said Khamenei had been killed at the hands of what he called the most wicked villains in the world, and described the strike as a declaration of open war on Muslims everywhere. Protests against the war spread to multiple countries in the weeks that followed, and in Pakistan alone, demonstrations tied to the conflict reportedly left 22 people dead and well over 100 injured, according to tracking of protest activity connected to the war. None of that unrest reversed the military outcome of February, but it is part of the backdrop, against which everything that came afterward, the ceasefire, the collapsed talks, and eventually the blockade itself, has to be understood. The rhetoric out of Washington in those early days was not subtle either. President Trump posted on his social media platform that Iran's navy was, in his words, sitting at the bottom of the sea, completely destroyed, and he specifically claimed 158 vessels had been sunk. He warned that any Iranian ship that came near the American blockade line would be, quote, immediately eliminated, comparing the rules of engagement to those used against maritime drug traffickers. At a Pentagon press conference days into the operation, General Dan Kane, the top 2 military commander, made the scope of the blockade explicit, stating it applied to all ships, regardless of nationality, heading into or out of Iranian ports. Standing beside him, Secretary Hegseth told reporters the blockade would hold as long as it takes, adding that the United States was doing it all with what he called less than 10% of America's total naval power. It was, in effect, a message aimed less at Tehran's remaining ships and more at Tehran's leadership. Comply or face an economic siege backed by a fleet Iran had no realistic way to challenge. For a stretch of about 6 weeks, the first blockade genuinely bit. Central Command's own numbers, released in a string of near-daily statements, described a steadily rising toll. By late May, the Pentagon put the running cost to Iran at roughly $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue, and separately estimated the blockade was costing Iran close to $500 million a day at its peak. CENTCOM reported it had disabled several commercial vessels that tried to run the line and redirected well over 100 others attempting to reach Iranian ports. According to tracking of the operation, by the time this first phase wound down around May 29th, the U.S. described roughly 85 vessels intercepted, with a smaller number, around 26, according to Lloyd's list, believed to have slipped through undetected. Iran, for its part, seized 2 cargo ships of its own during this window, a retaliatory move that briefly threatened to turn a one-sided economic squeeze into something closer to open naval confrontation. The economic shockwaves from that first closure spread well beyond Iran's own coastline. During the height of the February and March fighting, oil markets moved violently. The Dubai cash premium, which is what refiners pay above the official crude benchmark to physically secure barrels, spiked to $19.63 on March 5th, the highest level on record since tracking began in 2018, according to Gulf News reporting on regional energy markets. Qatar's energy minister, Saad Al-Kaabi, warned publicly that Gulf exporters would be forced to halt production entirely within days if tankers could not pass through the strait, a comment that triggered heavy defensive buying from Asian refiners in Japan and South Korea, who depend heavily on Middle Eastern crude. The UAE's main export grade, Murban crude, traded above both global and U.S. benchmark prices as traders priced in the risk that barrels could become physically trapped inside the Gulf. In one especially sharp episode of collateral damage, the UAE was forced to shut down its Ruwais refinery, the single biggest oil refining site in the region, after a drone attack sparked a fire there. Pakistan responded by offering naval escorts to commercial shipping in the area. France dispatched its own warships to the region. Egypt raised domestic fuel prices by as much as 30% to cushion the shock. Saudi Aramco's chief executive, Amin Nasser, told reporters at the time that the consequences for global oil markets would be, in his words, catastrophic the longer the disruption continued, and stressed it was absolutely critical that shipping resume through Hormuz. Then, in June, there was a genuine opening. The United States and Iran reportedly reached a memorandum of understanding, a 60-day framework aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz and restarting negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. For a few weeks, oil started moving again, and Gulf producers who had at one point cut output by an estimated 10 million barrels a day, roughly a tenth of global supply, began cautiously ramping back up. According to tracking published by United Against Nuclear Iran, a nonprofit that monitors Iranian shipping, 66 tankers loaded with Iranian oil and petrochemicals departed the Gulf of Oman between the announcement of the MOU on June 14th and early August, representing an estimated 80 million barrels and something in the neighborhood of $6 billion in revenue flowing back to the Iranian government, revenue UAE's analysts say continues to help fund the country's missile and drone programs. Oil prices, which had spiked earlier in the year, drifted back down below $90 a barrel during this calmer stretch. It looked, briefly, like de-escalation. It did not last. On July 13th, President Trump publicly dismissed the very deal his administration had helped negotiate. He told reporters the agreement, which weeks earlier he had called a great deal with the potential to unlock broader regional peace, had merely been a test. According to reporting from the Washington Post, Trump used the moment to announce the U.S. would reimpose the naval blockade on Iranian ports and floated an additional 20% fee on all shipping passing through the Strait of Hormuz, despite the U.S. government's own prior assertions that such a fee would likely violate international maritime law. That toll proposal did not survive long. According to Bloomberg's regional coverage, the very next day, after the idea drew widespread criticism from shipping industry groups and allied governments, Trump walked it back, saying it would instead be replaced by a series of Gulf state investment commitments into the United States, though the specifics of that arrangement have not been independently detailed by any named source since. The blockade formally returned at 4 in the afternoon Eastern Time on July 14th, and this time it came bundled with renewed airstrikes. CENTCOM described the reopening exchange as a powerful response to what it said were attempted Iranian attacks on U.S. forces in the region days earlier, striking dozens of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets, including military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities. Later that week, CENTCOM detailed a 7-hour wave of follow-up strikes involving fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, hitting additional Iranian missile sites, naval capabilities, and coastal defense systems, explicitly framed by Central Command as an effort to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and civilian crews. Live coverage from that period described it as the 4th consecutive night of American strikes against Iranian targets, with Iranian state media claiming, in return, that Tehran had struck U.S. military assets in neighboring Jordan. It was, in other words, not a clean return to the earlier standoff. This second blockade began life already tangled up with an active exchange of fire, and by the end of July, oil prices were once again climbing on the back of it, only easing when Saudi Arabia proposed forming an international naval coalition to protect commercial shipping from attack, a proposal that briefly calmed markets ahead of an OPEC Plus meeting, where producers were expected to approve a modest supply increase of roughly 188,000 barrels a day heading into September. The reopened front did not stay contained to Iran's own coastline for long. On July 20th, Yemen's Houthi movement, which is backed by Tehran and has fought its own long war against a Saudi-led coalition, declared its own naval blockade, this one targeting Saudi Arabian ports, opening what Al Jazeera described as a potential new front in the broader conflict. The stakes there are significant on their own terms. The Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, is barely 18 miles wide at its narrowest point, and normally carries something like 4.1 billion barrels of crude and refined product a year, roughly 5% of the entire global total. Analysts quoted by Al Jazeera warned that if Bab al-Mandeb were to shut down on top of an already disrupted Strait of Hormuz, the two choke points together could block up to a quarter of the world's entire oil and gas supply at the same time. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry said it would take all necessary measures to protect its vessels. According to shipping updates from United Against Nuclear Iran, the Houthis began threatening tankers attempting to cross Bab el-Mandeb, with reports the group was even considering charging a toll to vessels wanting safe passage, while reportedly exempting Chinese-flagged ships under a separate understanding. On July 22nd, the Houthis claimed responsibility for striking 2 tankers carrying Saudi crude in the Red Sea. By early August, the Joint Maritime Information Centre and the UK's Maritime Trade Operations Authority were reporting additional attacks, including one cargo ship struck by an unmanned surface vessel near Bab el-Mandeb on August 4th that later capsized, though the crew was reported safe. The pattern is not subtle. As the American blockade squeezes Iranian ports on one side of the Arabian Peninsula, Iran's regional partners appear to be applying pressure of their own on the other side, threatening to widen a maritime conflict that started as a 2-country standoff into something that touches nearly every major shipping lane in the region. The disruption has already pushed at least one Gulf state to rethink its long-term exposure. Bloomberg's regional economic coverage reports the UAE is now actively planning new export infrastructure built outside the Strait of Hormuz entirely, a long-term hedge against ever being this dependent on one narrow waterway again. Back around the Strait of Hormuz itself, the numbers kept climbing through the first half of August, and Central Command has been remarkably transparent about publishing them. As of August 2nd, the U.S. had redirected 35 commercial vessels, attempting to reach or leave Iranian ports since the July 14th restart. By August 4th, that number had grown to 45. A day later, on August 5th, CENTCOM's count stood at 48 vessels redirected, alongside 2 disabled for noncompliance and 2 more boarded, to confirm they were following the rules. By August 10th, the running total had jumped again, to 55 vessels turned away, with the Pentagon specifically noting an additional 20 ships blocked that single day, even as prospects for resumed negotiations, in the Pentagon's own assessment, looked bleak. And according to live coverage from Fox News published today, August 13th, that number now stands at 59 vessels redirected away from Iranian ports since the blockade's reimposition. Layer that on top of the numbers from the spring phase, and it starts to explain why Secretary Hegseth, back in June during the first blockade period, told reporters outside CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa that the operation had by then halted nearly 140 ships tied to Iranian trade. Whatever the exact cumulative figure is today, the trend line across both phases points in only one direction. The clearest evidence of just how effective this squeeze has become isn't coming from a press release at all, it's coming from orbit. Bloomberg reported on August 10th that satellite data from the European Union's Sentinel program shows Iran's oil terminals looking largely idle throughout the month. Across 6 separate satellite images taken during the first 9 days of August, no supertankers were visible at Kharg Island, which is Iran's primary crude export terminal near Bandar Abbas, and normally one of the busiest oil loading points on the planet. Only 2 smaller vessels were seen moored at the Jask and Soroush facilities during that same window. Bloomberg's own reporting is careful to note that visibility into Iran's shipping operations remains patchy, and that satellite snapshots can miss activity between passes, but the pattern lines up precisely with what United Against Nuclear Iran has independently tracked on the water. Their August 12th update describes Iranian oil tankers now clustering in anchorages along Iran's own coastline instead of returning to port, because the blockade makes coming home too risky. Some of those same tankers, once they do manage to depart loaded with crude, are heading not back toward Iran, but toward waiting anchorages scattered across the Indo-Pacific, including a cluster of more than a dozen empty vessels sitting off Galé, Sri Lanka, going nowhere, essentially in maritime limbo, as of the most recent tracking published this week. UNE's analysts also note that roughly 50 Iran-flagged cargo ships continue to operate more openly elsewhere in the world, across the Indo-Pacific, the Red Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and even the Baltic Sea. A reminder that Iran's so-called ghost fleet has spent years building redundancy specifically to survive exactly this kind of pressure. None of this comes without a wider economic ripple that reaches far past Bandar Abbas. The Strait of Hormuz, under normal conditions, carries something like a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and roughly a fifth of the planet's liquefied natural gas shipments. When a choke point that significant gets partially closed for months at a time, energy markets notice, and so do ordinary consumers thousands of miles away. Reporting drawing on Pentagon estimates from earlier this year put Iran's direct losses from the blockade at close to $4.8 billion in oil revenue by late May alone, a figure that predates the entire second phase that began in July. It's worth being precise here about what is confirmed and what is estimate. The vessel redirection counts come directly from CENTCOM's own public statements and are aligned with independent tanker tracking data from UANI, so those numbers carry real weight. The revenue loss figures, on the other hand, are Pentagon estimates, not independently audited financial data, and analysts caution that things like the exact discount China pays for sanctioned Iranian crude are not publicly disclosed, which makes any dollar figure attached to Iran's shadow trade an informed approximation rather than a hard fact. There's a reason the Pentagon chose a physical blockade instead of just leaning harder on financial sanctions, and it has a name: China. According to reporting from CNBC and Al Jazeera, China purchases somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the oil Iran exports, and the vast majority of that trade runs through small, independently owned Chinese refineries known as teapots, most of them clustered in Shandong province. These refineries operate with limited exposure to the U.S. financial system, which has historically made them difficult to pressure through sanctions alone. In April, the Treasury Department sanctioned Hengli Petrochemical's Dalian refinery, calling it one of Tehran's most valued customers and saying it had generated hundreds of millions of dollars for Iran's military. Treasury also designated roughly 40 vessels and shipping firms tied to what officials call Iran's shadow fleet, ships that manipulate their location data, conduct ship-to-ship transfers in places like the Strait of Malacca, and sometimes relabel Iranian crude as what the industry nicknames Malaysian blend to disguise its true origin. CNN's own reporting on the network describes satellite imagery showing dozens of these vessels clustering at an anchorage off Malaysia known as the Eastern Outer Port Limits, a long documented waypoint in the laundering of sanctioned Iranian crude before it reaches Chinese refineries. China's response to the American pressure campaign has been defiant. On May 2nd, Beijing invoked a legal mechanism known as its blocking rules, first adopted in 2021, to formally shield 5 sanctioned teapot refineries from the reach of U.S. measures, with China's Ministry of Commerce calling the sanctions a violation of international law. That standoff matters here because it explains why a naval blockade, something that physically stops ships rather than just threatening banks, became the tool of choice. If financial sanctions alone could not stop China's teapot refineries from buying discounted Iranian crude, the Navy positioning itself directly outside Iranian ports became, in the administration's own logic, the more reliable lever. It is also part of why Secretary Hegseth's use of the word indefinitely carries extra weight. Sanctions can be evaded with paperwork and blended cargo manifests. A destroyer sitting outside Bandar Abbas cannot be argued around the same way. Iran, for its part, is not describing any of this the way Washington is. According to live reporting published just hours ago, Iranian officials are disputing President Trump's characterization of the situation entirely, insisting that the Strait of Hormuz remains under Iran's control, not America's. That directly contradicts the picture painted by Hegseth and by Central Command, and it is a genuinely unverified contested claim, one that cannot be independently confirmed through satellite tracking or shipping data the way the blockade numbers can. What is better documented is Iran's list of conditions for actually reopening the strait on its own terms. According to the Council on Foreign Relations' ongoing conflict tracker, Tehran has stated it will not reopen Hormuz until the United States lifts its naval blockade entirely, pays compensation for the damage done during the February and July strikes, lifts the broader sanctions regime that has strangled Iran's economy for years, and releases Iranian financial assets that remain frozen in foreign banks. That is a demanding list, and there is no indication, as of this week, that Washington is prepared to meet any part of it. A durable settlement remains elusive, with the core disputes over Iran's nuclear program, control of the Strait, and sanctions relief all still unresolved. There's also a human cost to this operation that rarely makes it into the official statements about tanker counts, and it involves the American side of the blockade line, not just Iran's. The aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln has been deployed to the Middle East in support of this operation for what CENTCOM itself now describes as more than 260 consecutive days at sea, during which its air wing has flown over 10,000 sorties and expended roughly 1.5 million pounds of ordnance. That is an extraordinary operational tempo for any single carrier strike group to sustain. This week, CENTCOM found itself publicly pushing back against media reports alleging poor conditions aboard the Lincoln, including claims of a violent brawl among sailors and a spike in suicidal ideation during the deployment. In a formal statement, Central Command called those specific claims false. Secretary Hegseth, addressing the same reports directly today, called them completely misrepresented and said the Navy makes sure every ship, every crew, and every captain has everything that can be provided at every moment, while acknowledging that some deployments run longer than others. Whatever the truth of those specific allegations, and neither side's account can be fully verified from outside the chain of command, the underlying fact that a single carrier has now been forward deployed for the better part of a year gives you a sense of just how much sustained American military resourcing this blockade actually requires, month after month, with no clear end written into any plan. There is also, separately, an ongoing transparency dispute in Washington itself, with reporting noting the Pentagon has moved to shield certain unclassified but sensitive Iran-related documents from Freedom of Information Act requests, on the grounds that releasing them could expose national defense vulnerabilities, a policy shift that could affect the release of records handled by roughly 2.8 million Defense Department employees and contractors. It's also worth putting this into a longer historical frame, because the Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint between Washington and Tehran before, and the parallels are instructive. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, in what became known as the Tanker War, both countries attacked neutral oil shipping in the Gulf, and the United States eventually launched Operation Earnest Will, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag and escorting them through the strait with the Navy, a campaign that stretched on for roughly a year and a half and included direct naval clashes with Iranian forces. That earlier standoff is a reminder that American military planners have for decades treated freedom of navigation through Hormuz as a strategic red line worth committing sustained naval resources to defend, even when the underlying political dispute dragged on far longer than anyone initially expected. What's different this time is the direction of the pressure. In the 1980s, the U.S. Navy was protecting tanker traffic moving through the strait. Today, it is the one restricting it, turning the same choke point that Washington once fought to keep open into the exact instrument being used to squeeze Tehran. That inversion, using the strait as a weapon rather than defending it as an open corridor, is part of why analysts describe the current blockade as a genuinely novel escalation, rather than simply the latest chapter in a decades-old rivalry. Which brings us back to today, and to that word, indefinitely. When Secretary Hegseth used it this week, he wasn't improvising. He tied it to a specific operational logic. The Navy rotates carrier strike groups, destroyer squadrons, and support vessels in and out of theater on a schedule, which means, in principle, the blockade doesn't have a natural expiration date the way a single ship's fuel or a single crew's endurance might impose. As long as political leadership in Washington wants the pressure to continue, the Navy's own doctrine allows it to continue indefinitely in his own word, regardless of how long that turns out to be. That is a meaningfully different posture than what Hegseth was saying back in April, when as long as it takes still implied, at least rhetorically, that there was some endpoint tied to Iranian behavior. Indefinitely drops even that pretense. It signals a blockade designed to be sustainable on America's own terms, independent of anything Tehran does or doesn't do next. Financial markets tracking this standoff seem to agree that there's no quick resolution coming. According to prediction market data referenced in recent financial reporting, contracts betting on whether the blockade will still be in place by the end of this year were pricing in a 77.9% chance of yes as of this week. Shorter-term bets are even more pessimistic about any quick end. The market tracking whether the blockade gets lifted by August 15th, just 2 days from now, was sitting at only 15% yes, and the odds of it ending by August 31st had actually fallen, dropping from 40% down to 33.5% in the span of a single day, reportedly moving in response to renewed naval activity and Iran's continued aggressive posture in the region. None of that is a guarantee of anything. Prediction markets are not oracles. But it does suggest that people with money on the line are reading this the same way Hegseth's own word choice suggests. This is not a blockade. Anyone in Washington is planning to lift soon. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where all of this information actually comes from and where the genuine uncertainty still sits. The vessel redirection numbers throughout this story, 35, 45, 48, 55, 59, come directly from U.S. Central Command's own public statements, cross-referenced against independent tanker tracking published by United Against Nuclear Iran, so those figures are about as well documented as anything in this conflict gets. The satellite imagery showing an idle Kharg Island comes from Bloomberg's reporting on European Sentinel satellite data, although Bloomberg itself flags that visibility remains imperfect. The origins of the war, the February 28th strikes, and the death of Ali Khamenei are confirmed by Iran's own government, alongside independent encyclopedic and conflict tracking sources, including the Council on Foreign Relations. Quotes from Secretary Hegseth, General Kane, and President Trump come from on-the-record statements reported by outlets including Al Jazeera, Euronews, The Times of Israel, and Fox News. What remains genuinely contested, and should be treated as such, is Iran's claim that it, not the United States, currently controls the Strait of Hormuz. That claim comes only from Iranian officials, has not been corroborated by any independent tracking service, and directly conflicts with the CENTCOM and Pentagon account. Similarly, the exact dollar figures tied to Iran's oil revenue losses are Pentagon estimates rather than audited numbers. The reported Gulf State investment package replacing the scrapped Hormuz toll has never been detailed by name, and allegations about conditions aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln remain disputed between independent media reports and CENTCOM's own denial, and should all be understood with that caveat attached. Even with prices having pulled back from their spring peaks, the residue of 6 months of intermittent closure hasn't gone away. Bloomberg's regional economic reporting notes that even if Hormuz reopens fully at some point, insurance costs for tankers operating anywhere near the Gulf are likely to stay elevated for a long time, as ship owners price in the real possibility of another sudden closure. Some Gulf producers, at the height of the disruption, were forced to cut output by an estimated 10 million barrels a day between them, roughly a tenth of global supply, before cautiously restoring it during the brief June and July calm. That kind of swing doesn't just move headline oil prices. It ripples into insurance premiums, shipping contracts, and long-term investment decisions across the entire region, which is a large part of why the UAE, as mentioned earlier, is now actively building export capacity that bypasses the strait altogether, treating this year's crisis as a permanent argument for redundancy rather than a temporary inconvenience to wait out. So where does that leave things, heading into the second half of August, with Bandar Abbas and the rest of Iran's Gulf coast still sitting under that blockade line, and with the word indefinite now officially on the record from the Pentagon itself? A conflict that began with a decapitation strike in February has, 6 months later, settled into something closer to a long-term siege, one measured not in weeks, but in carrier rotations, one where the ships turned away get counted almost daily, and where neither side appears close to accepting the other's conditions for ending it. Bandar Abbas sits at the center of that siege, a port city that, under normal circumstances, would be moving a meaningful share of the world's energy supply and is instead, this week, largely still. Do you think a blockade like this can actually hold indefinitely without eventually forcing a wider confrontation, or does an open-ended commitment like that usually end up creating more pressure to escalate than to negotiate? That's a genuine question worth sitting with. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this one as it develops.